Hello, welcome everyone to the talk of Dr. Heidi Janz. I'd like to start by acknowledging, are we okay? Acknowledging that we're on the unceded and ancestral, the stolen lands of the Musqueam people here at UBC. And I'd also like to acknowledge the many people and departments that made this talk possible. Dr. Boyd, who facilitated support from the Department of Physical Therapy, Dr. Tim Staten, who facilitated support for the Center for Citizenship and Inclusion, Dr. Chapman, who facilitated support from the Public Humanities Hub, and Dr. Andre Mazawi, who facilitated support from the Department of Educational Studies. I'd also like to thank the amazing staff from the Public Humanities Hub, who have been working hard to get this talk going and deal with all the tensions of stresses of technology. Sydney Lines, Heidi Reinhardt, and Heather Tam. And finally, to Tel Jars from Occupational Therapy, and Hee-Jong Kim for helping us as well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Heidi Janz. Somebody we've been co-conspirators for what, 40 years since high school. And Dr. Janz is going to talk today about medical assistance in dying legislation. Dr. Janz is a PhD in English. She's a playwright, accomplished filmmaker. She has 2 films that you may want to watch that are excellent and have won awards. We regret to inform you, and not a one-way street. She has been an expert witness for the parliamentary subcommittee looking at Maid legislation, as well as the Senate subcommittee. There's so much more I could say, but I want to give you a chance to talk. And finally, Dr. Janz is, not quite finally, an adjunct at the Doster Center of Health Ethics in the University of Alberta, and also an adjunct faculty here at UBC in the Masters in Educational Technology program, where we co-developed and teach a course together on ableism and educational technology. With that, Dr. Janz is going to use voice-activated software to give her talk, and then there'll be time for questions and answers after that. Thank you. Okay. Let us hope this works.
2020 and the advent of COVID-19 ushered in a time of new peril for disabled people in Canada. Government and public health officials repeated their daily mantra, "We're all in this together," while at the same time creating policies and legislation which made it clear that disabled Canadians are not part of the we. Provinces quietly developed critical care triage protocols which would prohibit many disabled people from receiving critical care in the event that a surge in severe COVID cases outstripped available resources, and at the national level, government pushed through an expansion of medical assistance in dying, Maid, despite overwhelming opposition from major disability rights organizations, scholars, activists and the United Nations. In this presentation, I draw on my research and experience as a disability ethics educator and advocate in order to demonstrate that both Canada's COVID-19 response and its expansion of eligibility for Maid are symptoms of the medical and systemic ableism that afflicts Canadian society. I will conclude the presentation with a consideration of the enduring danger that eugenic ableism disguised as autonomy poses for people with disabilities in a Canada where COVID-19 may be waning, but the contagion of ableism, turned lethal through Maid, continues to spread. Let's begin, then, with a basic question: what is ableism? Ableism can be defined as prejudice and discrimination against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. Like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than, and perpetuates harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations about people with disabilities. Clear, yet unacknowledged, evidence of ableism can be seen in everything from the way in which buildings are built to exclude people who do not walk or see, to the way in which students with disabilities are taught that it's better to look, move, and behave as much like their non-disabled peers as possible, to the way in which terms associated with disability are used as insults in everyday language. Unlike racism or sexism, however, ableism remains. In the words of Canadian disability scholar, Gregor Walbring, one of the most societally entrenched and accepted isms. Ableism becomes systemic as patterns of discriminatory and exclusionary practices against people with disabilities are entrenched in sectors which are fundamental to societal membership, sectors such as education, employment, and housing. Limited access and opportunities in one of these key sectors, such as education, often automatically leads to further restrictions in employment opportunities, which, in turn, limits housing options. One key sector in which ableism is most deeply rooted is healthcare. Indeed, disability scholar Fiona Kumari Campbell draws a direct link between ableism and a biomedical paradigm, in that she defines ableism as a network of beliefs, processes and practices that produces a particular kind of self and body, the corporeal standard, that is projected as the perfect, species typical and therefore essential and fully human. Disability then, is cast as a diminished state of being human. Campbell delineates an inherent link between this deficit-based construction of disability and a biomedicalist stance, which, since the age of reason, has played a critical intervening role in the lives of people with disability and people with anomalous bodies or mentalities. Medicine has operated as the primary paradigm not only for the treatment of disabled bodies but has also shaped the way decision makers, legislators, families and society in general think about and sense disability. Despite the major role that medical professionals play in the lives of people with disabilities, research indicates that people with disabilities frequently encounter discrimination in healthcare settings, even in ordinary, non-pandemic times. As disability ethicist Joel Reynolds argues, ableism is endemic to medicine. Quote, ableism has unfortunately been a central and unquestioned part of medicine across its history. If the idea that being normal is best is taken as common sense, evidence to the contrary will be judged as suspect, including the evidence that people with disabilities are often as happy as people without disabilities. Ableism is especially problematic for clinicians because insofar as it operates in the background of their knowledge and expertise, it can actively undermine best practices and negatively impact health outcomes without clinicians even realizing it. End quote. In fact, studies have consistently shown that, as a group, healthcare professionals tend to substantially underestimate the quality of life of people with disabilities. Most recently, a survey of more than 700 U.S. physicians, across several specialties, found that just over 82% of physicians reported that people with disabilities have a significantly worse quality of life than non-disabled people. Given that endemic ableism in medicine is a condition which pre-existed the current pandemic, there is a sense in which it should be entirely unsurprising that the advent of COVID-19 has proven to be a very dangerous, and potentially lethal complication for people with disabilities. Throughout the early days of the pandemic, public health messaging invariably featured the slogan, "We're all in this together." The optimists among us may have initially been tempted to point to this discourse as a sign of a resurgence in the ethic of the common good, and, with it, an increase in the value that our society attributes to the lives of vulnerable seniors and people with disabilities. Unfortunately, however, it was not long until the first schism in the public conception of we emerged. Public health officials urged that we needed to come together to protect elders and those who are vulnerable among us. Inherent in the discourse of this public health imperative is the subtle yet clear distinction between the healthy, majority we, and the sick and vulnerable minority they. As Goggin and Ellis point out, The way that elderly or people with pre-existing medical conditions were widely presented in much mainstream media, was, as both those at most risk, but also as almost disposable. This is a rather convenient response, whereby people with non-normative bodies play a traditional function of reassuring the, temporarily, able-bodied of their normality. In other words, COVID-19 public health messaging has, on one hand, presented disabled and elderly people as worthy objects for the general, temporarily able-bodied population's compassion and sacrifice, but, on the other hand, inevitably easy prey for a predatory virus. I would argue that both of these constructions are rooted in medical ableism. Just as COVID-19 is not confined by national borders, the prevalence of medical ableism that the pandemic has revealed likewise transcends geographical boundaries. As Panokia and colleagues observe, quote, although different countries have proposed different guidelines to manage this emergency, these proposed criteria do not sufficiently consider people living with disabilities. People living with disabilities are therefore at a higher risk of exclusion from medical treatment, as physicians tend to assume they have poor quality of life. End quote. In the same vein, Ignani and colleagues identify an ableist, utilitarian mindset, which they call eugenic logic, underpinning most worldwide healthcare responses to COVID-19. Such as critical care triage protocols which list pre-existing disability as an exclusion criterion for receiving critical care in the event that the system is overwhelmed, and critical care resources need to be rationed. Like critical care triage protocols which list pre-existing disability as an exclusion criterion for critical care, the implementation of so-called essential visitor policies in hospitals has jeopardized people with disabilities, particularly those who have communication disabilities and/or rely on support people to assist them with personal care. Throughout the pandemic, Altschuler and colleagues argue that, quote, the ability for patients to communicate effectively with medical providers, and vice versa, is essential to providing safe, equitable, and quality care. A wide variety of patients may experience communication challenges during a hospital admission, ranging from those with low health literacy, language differences, new or pre-existing communication impairments, and sensory impairments. Without access to supportive communication strategies, patients are at risk for adverse events, increased sedation, increased anxiety, increased familial burden to act as a translator, and less successful communication attempts. Globally, hospitals have imposed restrictions to limit the number of visitors and staff interacting with patients. By limiting the number of people at the bedside of COVID-19 positive patients or patients under investigation, fewer people are potentially exposed to the virus. However, these restrictions can also result in fewer communicative exchanges, less frequent visits from nurses between cares, reduced access to in-person language interpreters, and increased challenges procuring setup or adjustment of communication materials. Furthermore, fewer visitors and staff may result in fewer supports being available to the patient to monitor and assist with the charging of electronic communication supports, for example, dedicated communication devices, phones, tablets, and ensuring that these devices are connected to cellular or hospital Wi-Fi services. End quote. Given the vital role that people who provide communication and/or personal care supports have in the lives of people with disabilities, Boyle and colleagues point to the crucial need for exceptions to hospital no-visitor policies in order to ensure the safety and well-being of patients with disabilities. Quote, the no-visitor policies adopted by hospitals to protect patients, hospital personnel, and visitors is particularly problematic for patients with disabilities who rely on assistance with activities of daily living. Exceptions to the no-visitor policy are needed to ensure that known and acknowledged support persons, such as designated family member, direct support professionals, or other designated caregivers, are permitted to be with the patient starting with admission and through to the care, treatment process. Such an exception would improve communication between the hospital staff and people with disabilities and allow for informed and shared decision making. End quote. Thanks to a severe bout of pneumonia in November of 2020, I have first-hand knowledge of the issues and concerns raised by Altschuler and colleagues and Boyle and colleagues. As someone whose disabilities include a significant speech impairment, I've made it a rule never to go into ER without an aide or a friend with me to assist me with communication. This is because the risk of my not being able to make myself understood to clinicians and other healthcare personnel is great, and my risk of having an adverse outcome due to a combination of miscommunication with the medical team and the high probability that the prevalence of medical ableism could result in erroneous judgments being made about my quality of life is even greater. But the advent of COVID-19 suddenly rendered my policy of never going to ER alone not applicable. Thus it was that, in the wee hours of the night, I entered ER entirely alone, in respiratory distress, and, frankly, terrified. Why was I terrified? Well, first of all, of course, there was the whole having trouble breathing thing, but also, there were memories of the numerous first-hand accounts that I'd heard over the years from friends and colleagues with disabilities who have had DNR orders arbitrarily placed on their charts without their knowledge, and who have consequently needed family and friends to monitor their charts for the appearance of unauthorized DNR orders, and to advocate for their removal. Similarly, there were more recent anecdotal accounts that I'd heard from friends and colleagues with disabilities about physicians asking them, repeatedly, whether they would want interventions that would generally be considered routine for non-disabled people, interventions such as receiving supplemental oxygen through nasal cannula, and then being asked, again, "Are you sure?" It was having all these things percolating in my mind that caused me to preemptively respond to the ER doc's inquiry about goals of care with all the clarity and force that my 82% oxygen saturated lungs could muster. R1. Over the years, I have often remarked that I should make and carry a card that says, "I have multiple physical disabilities caused by cerebral palsy. I am also a university professor who works in an ethics center and specializes in disability ethics. I respectfully ask that you keep both these things in mind when you interact with me." Unfortunately, I have never actually acted on this idea. This is because, as I've already alluded to, in pre-COVID times, it would have been unthinkable for me to go into ER on my own. Fortunately, I had two saving graces during my first 18 hours in ER that helped mitigate the potential hazards from my not having such a card. First of all of the friends, aides, and fraides, combination friend and aide, who would normally have been taking shifts being with me in hospital were now calling the hospital to check on me. This alerted the nursing staff to the fact that I was very much connected to a community of support outside the hospital. Secondly, I had the blessing of an exceptionally attentive nurse who combined my care with assisting me to make and receive phone calls and text messages. One such phone call was from my brother, saying that he'd just received a phone call from my doctor to discuss my diagnosis. With some consternation, I told my brother that I had yet to see said doctor. However, a couple of hours earlier, a resident had come in to take my medical history, or rather, he attempted to take my medical history. It was clear to me from my very brief interaction with him that none of my responses to his questions had registered with him. This, I surmised, was what prompted my attending physician to call my brother. A relevant piece of information about the division of labor in my family is that, I have long been the go-to person for any and all medical decisions involving our aging parents, and, of course, myself. In return, my brother, the engineer, deals with all things logistical, practical, and not involving human emotion. But now, my poor brother, with all the tranquility of a deer caught in headlights, was compelled to relay the information he was given about my rather complex medical condition, as it had been related to him by my attending physician, who I had yet to meet. After I finished the call, I exclaimed to my nurse, who looked, almost, as exasperated as I felt, "You know, I'm a professor at the Ethics Center at the University of Alberta. I can handle conversations about my condition." After uttering an expletive, the nurse said, "I'm going to go find your doctor and make him come talk to you." I didn't actually see this, but I could envision her dragging the doctor by the ear to my bedside. At any rate, the doctor did come and have an actual conversation with me about my condition and treatment plan, and I'm happy to report that, for the remainder of my hospital stay, everyone on my treatment team interacted and engaged with me as they would with any other patient. Nevertheless, my experience has left me deeply concerned about what happens to people with physical and/or communication disabilities who are forced to go into ER alone, due to pandemic restrictions, but who do not have the benefit of either an exceptionally observant and attentive nurse, or the status of having a job that's healthcare related. In my view, this is an issue that the healthcare system urgently needs to address. This is because the chances of people with disabilities suffering adverse consequences due to ableist assumptions being made about their condition is simply too great. Like many of the healthcare responses to COVID-19, the expansion of eligibility for Maid in Canada to include people with disabilities who are not at end of life is demonstrably rooted in medical ableism. To begin with, as healthcare professionals, Maid assessors are not immune to the prevalent influence of medical ableism rooted in eugenic logic. This becomes particularly significant in light of the fact that studies consistently demonstrate that healthcare professionals who provide care to disabled individuals are often more pessimistic and upset about their charges' prognoses than the affected individuals themselves. Some may argue that this is essentially a moot point because people with disabilities meet with Maid assessors only after they have already applied for Maid. However, such an argument fails to take into consideration the fact that, among other things, Maid assessors are tasked with determining the greatest source of suffering that is prompting a person's request for Maid. Maid assessors afflicted with undiagnosed ableism are likely to automatically view the existence of disability, in and of itself, as the greatest source of a person's suffering. They thus risk conflating suffering stemming from remediable social conditions, such as poverty and the lack of affordable, accessible housing and community-based, user-directed personal support services, with the irremediable presence of disability. One recent casualty of such ableism was Sophia. Sophia was the preferred pseudonym of a 51-year-old Ontario woman with severe sensitivities to chemicals who chose medically assisted death after her desperate search for affordable housing free of cigarette smoke and chemical cleaners failed. She had multiple chemical sensitivities, MCS, a chronic condition also referred to as an environmental illness or environmental allergies. "The government sees me as expendable trash, a complainer, useless and a pain in the ass," Sophia said in a video filmed on February 14, 2022, 8 days before her death. Avis Favaro of CTV News reports, quote, "She died after a frantic effort by friends, supporters and even her doctors to get her safe and affordable housing in Toronto." She also left behind letters showing a desperate 2-year search for help, in which she begs local, provincial and federal officials for assistance in finding a home away from the smoke and chemicals wafting through her apartment. Letters she wrote said that indoor cigarette and pot smoking increased, sending fumes through her Scarborough apartment building's ventilation system. More chemical cleaners were used in the hallways that worsened her symptoms. She confined herself to her bedroom, or dungeon, as she called it, for most of the pandemic, sealing the vents to keep cigarette and pot smoke from wafting into her unit. For Toronto doctors were aware of Sophia's case and they also wrote to federal housing and disability government officials on her behalf. In that letter the doctors confirmed that her symptoms improved in cleaner air environments and asked for help to find or build a chemical-free residence. We physicians find it unconscionable that no other solution is proposed to this situation other than medical assistance in dying, they wrote. End quote. Sadly, it was only after her death that Sophia's story garnered any kind of public attention, but even more sad, indeed, maddening, is that, when Sophia's story finally did generate some posthumous media attention, it prompted some champions of Maid to subtly cast aspersions on its veracity. For example, in a June 24, 2022 tweet, Linda Furlow of Dying with Dignity Canada's Nova Scotia chapter lamented, "It is very disheartening to read so much misinformation about Maid, suggesting that people can be found eligible for any number of reasons such as old age and lack of social supports." The fact, however, is that Sophia was indeed a real person, who personally reached out to many Canadian disability rights advocates, including myself, for help in her desperate fight for safe housing. As a result, her story featured in testimony given by disability rights advocates to the House of Commons Justice Committee studying Bill C-7 in the fall of 2020. They testified that, if Bill C-7 was passed and Maid was expended, people like Sophia, people worn down and worn out by years of trying unsuccessfully to get the supports they need to live, will ultimately be left with no other option but Maid. In the words of Jerome Bickenbach, when an individual chooses death as the only viable way to escape an intolerable situation partly brought on by the social environment, it seems perverse and unfair to say that this is an expression of self-determination or autonomy. A personal postscript to Sophia's story, taped to the wall by my computer at home, is a letter that Sophia wrote to me 3 days before her death by Maid. In the letter, she thanked me for my efforts to advocate on her behalf, apologized that she did not have the strength to continue to fight, and asked that I continued to tell her story in the hopes that, one day, people with disabilities in Canada who find themselves in situations similar to hers will not be driven to seek Maid as their only option when they no longer have the strength to fight for their right to live. I keep Sophia's card where I can see it every day to remind myself of what, and who, is at stake in the ongoing disability rights advocacy work to stop the so-called right to die from nullifying people with disabilities' right to life. The Parliamentary and Senate Committee studies of Bill C-7, the proposed expansion of eligibility for Maid, took place in the fall and winter of 2020 to 2021, while the entire country was under pandemic lockdown. The breathtaking irony of this situation is that, at the very time when government and public health officials were urging Canadians to take precautions and even to make sacrifices for the sake of protecting the lives of vulnerable people, some of these same government officials were working to push through a bill which would make many of these same vulnerable people eligible for a state-sanctioned death. The kind of logical and ethical contortions that this required had to be of Olympic caliber, matched only by the logical and ethical contortions that it took to quote from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in the preamble to Bill C-7, when 3 UN human rights experts declared Canada's Maid regime to be in violation of that very convention. Thus, it is clear that systemic ableism in Canada is, not just alive, but thriving, with the passing of Bill C-7, and current efforts to further expand eligibility for Maid to include people with a sole diagnosis of mental illness and so-called mature minors, including kids with disabilities. As someone who had most of my K-12 education at a school for kids with physical disabilities, I find this latest impending expansion of eligibility for a state-sanctioned death particularly chilling. Roughly half of the kids in our school had life-limiting conditions like muscular dystrophy, which, at that time, had a life expectancy of 14 to 18 years. Every student in that school grew up knowing that some of us would live longer than others, but we also knew that all of us would live with the best quality of life possible, until we died. This is not the message that Canadian kids with disabilities growing up in this brave new world of Maid for mature minors will receive. Instead, they are more likely to hear, "Well, it's only natural that you're depressed and tired of your life. You're disabled, maybe you should just go get Maid." There is a palpable, if generally unacknowledged, sense of déjà vu surrounding the eugenic philosophy underpinning the relentless expansion of Maid in Canada. Washington Post columnist, Charles Lane, articulated this disquieting déjà vu in a recent article in which he mused about similarities between the current Maid program and Canada's residential schools. Quote, "One of the most haunting aspects of the Canadian Indian residential school system was that one of Canada's worst historical crimes was managed and defended by people who fervently believed they were doing the right thing for the Indian," Tristan Hopper wrote in the National Post last year. As they expand euthanasia today, Canadians should bear in mind that they, too, are subject to the law of unintended consequences and to the judgment of future generations. End quote. Indeed, there is an urgent need for Canadian policymakers to consider the law of unintended consequences as growing numbers of disabled Canadians, young and old, are being plagued to death by ableism. Thank you for.
Want to take questions? Can we see? We can't see questions. Oh, if I go to the right. Yeah. Right. That would make sense. I do make you do. All right. Yes, it will ask if there's any questions. There's an audience here as well as an audience online. Because our sound system in the room isn't working great, if there's people in the audience here who have questions, maybe I'll get you to come up. We'll get them to come up here so you can hear them on the audio. Oh, also I could repeat the questions. That is a good point. Yes. All right. Thanks. Questions?
So I
Oh,
guess
yeah.
the question would be, what is the next step
For
for overcoming what happened then?
So the question is, what is the next step for overcoming what's happening here? Great question. A question the disabled community has been asking a lot. This might sound impractical, but truly the only way this is going to turn around is if Canadian society wakes up to the reality that the Maid is a eugenics practice. And that and start speaking up against it, because disabled people have been speaking up against it for over 30 years, since the Robert Latimer case.
And politicians to not because not large in the voting bloc.
And politicians choose to ignore us because we're not a large enough vote, seen as a large enough voting bloc.
No, we need help.
So we need help. Sorry.
Thank you for your talk. It was illuminating and chilling. I guess the one concept that you shared at the end was new to me, this idea of so-called mature minors. And I'm curious how far along that concept is in terms of being realized in the law. And
I'll repeat the question there.
where did it come from? Like, who's
Ah.
advocating?
So I'm just going to repeat the question. The question was around a mature minor and how that concept has come about and who's advocating for it.
Yeah, and kind of where is it in terms of being realized?
And where is it in terms of being realized?
What about the no everything I can do the area of the convention
It's already been identified as the next area of expansion
after people from mental health.
after people with a diagnosis of mental health. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Psychiatric illness.
So the parliament hearing,
There'll be another round of parliamentary hearings.
I fully expect it to be done within a couple of
And I fully expect it to be a done deal within a couple years or less. Just gonna see if there's any, Andre, did you have a?
Yeah, first, thank you very much, Heidi, for calling us or for delivering this.
Speak up a bit so they can hear you there.
Sorry.
years.
Yes, I was saying, welcome Heidi to this space. On behalf of the Department of Educational Studies, we are very happy to have you with us. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I think the comments are very clear. My question is, can we reflect a little bit on what the kind of analysis you've provided us with could mean for faculties of education, such as ours, in ways of shifting gear to embed this concern in the way we educate teachers and how this could play out in schools? Thank you.
I think a very important way that agriculture for contribution is by teaching the concept of ableism.
I think a really important way that educators could contribute to this is by teaching the concept of ableism
And very kindergarten
as early as kindergarten grade 1. Even the concept of people might move differently or look different.
But that is
But that doesn't necessarily mean they have a bad life.
People kids who do the first going to go now office included and the
Another thing I worry about now is that kids are going to school, but often included, kids with disabilities are going to regular school, but often included, but actually excluded, isolated. Can I just go to, should we go to one of the questions here, then we'll go to you? Is that,
Made
oh,
me
go ahead.
very excited. Yeah.
Oh.
And I thank you so much for this. This is wonderful. I have two colleagues who are watching from home right now, but I was a graduate teaching assistant for ETSI 317, which is development and exceptionality in the classroom, with Dr. Carly Christensen.
Okay,
And we, for the first time, introduced a module on ableism for our teacher candidates. So it's definitely something we are trying to convey to new teachers coming through, to be aware of language, of practice, of procedure, things that are just ableist that people haven't thought of. And it sparked a lot of very interesting conversations with our teacher candidates this summer. So thank you. I just appreciate everything you're doing so much.
thank you. Okay, so one of the questions online is, okay. Thank you, Dr. Janz. I'm feeling a great deal of concern about the lack of interest or concern of other friends and community members. I'm hoping you'll share your slides so I can give to a number of people.
I believe
I believe that's already been done or will be done. Okay. Isabel Grant asks, your research talks about how entrenched ableism is to the point where we don't even recognize it as such. What has shocked me the most about this debate is how little shock there is amongst people we would otherwise think of as reasonable people. How do we get people to care about more people dying unnecessarily?
I think gonna come out
I think, yeah, excellent question. I think there's going to be a time where disabled people have to get radical and their allies.
I'm gonna have to focus my colleague on the kindness. Wisdom
My colleague and I went when there was the freedom, so-called the freedom convoy in Ottawa,
Oh.
right, quotes.
with the I would need to do
Well, it's what we thought we need to do is we need to get a whole fleet of transportation, the buses, yeah,
drive
and then drive.
to talk until you change the law
And park and say until you change the law.
with a good fellow going.
We Crips aren't going anywhere. Would be a protest to get behind. All right. I'll just do one more here. Good first question. As a caregiver to my mother with Alzheimer's who is in a home, I have to advocate for quality of life. What routes can I explore? Readings, conferences, political avenues.
Oh, very like I know typically Alzheimer's
The Alzheimer's, I know the Alzheimer's Society is pretty good. Typically.
But also, I know having that yeah,
I know, having cared for a parent with Alzheimer's, that there's a lot of extra. There's not a lot of extra energy, right, to advocate.
You can use me there and responsible
What you can do is be there as much as possible and remind the professionals that your mom may have Alzheimer's, but she's still a human being worthy of respect. Any other questions here before I go back to this? Okay. Oh, you'll like the next one. Is disabled direct action a possibility? I would say it's a very good possibility. Are you volunteering? I knew that was coming. Is it possible to get a list of the references Dr. Janz's sites? Yes. Do you have any thoughts about ideal approaches in healthcare training schools that might lessen ableism in learners?
Yeah, I agree with that.
At U of A, I've been working on modules on disability ethics. Specifically for the med school and rehab med. Did I get it?
I know.
I know typically there's in med schools. Oh, the mantra is there's no room for new stuff, extra stuff. This is not extra. This is fundamental. If somebody's interested in the modules, they can email me and we can talk some more. Okay, I think we have to, oh, we might have room for one more. Are you okay? One more question? Yeah, okay. Okay, here we are. Okay, I think I'm not seeing, I thought I saw something. All right, that's right. There was a question, but I have lost it and it's 1 o'clock. Yes, there is a slide. There are a couple people asking about your slides, which you said you'll send. Okay, I think that's, shall we end? Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. So Dr. Janz for always providing an insightful, provocative talk when we teach together. Shall I tell that when you're so happy somebody has insomnia? Yeah. So we must admit that sometimes when people say, Dr. Janz gave me so much to think about, I couldn't sleep last night, that the response is usually, woohoo, one more with insomnia. just temporarily, not for a long time. Thanks so much. Have a great day.